Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, October 9th, 2024. All right, so first thing I want to mention today is our fundraiser that we started this week. And this is how antiwar.com gets by. We are entirely funded by our readers. That's how we're able to do what we do, to provide this coverage of U.S. wars and interventions from our anti-war perspective, and to provide all the great viewpoints and opinion pieces from our columnists, and, gathering all this other information from different websites. We're able to do this because our readers think it is worth them supporting. So I hope if you appreciate this show, if you read antiwar.com and you have the means, that you could please chip in to help get this fundraiser going. As I mentioned yesterday, kind of our theme is we have a lot to focus on. There's a lot of moving parts right now in the Middle East, and other things, of course, going on in Ukraine and in the Asia Pacific, and even other places around the world that we should be keeping an eye on. So go to antiwar.com/donate, and you can see the different ways that you can help us out. Our goal is $100,000 for this fundraiser. This is the first one we've done in about 5 or 6 months, because the last one went so well. So I'm hoping that we have as strong of a turnout this time. So antiwar.com/donate to see the different ways you could help out. I appreciate everyone who chips in and pitches in to help us keep running the website. That's what this money goes directly toward, is basically paying the bills and keeping the lights on. So antiwar.com/donate. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today: the U.S. considers launching airstrikes against Iran. So the U.S. has discussed the idea of supporting Israel's expected attack on Iran with intelligence or with airstrikes of its own. And this was reported by NBC News on Tuesday, citing two unnamed U.S. officials. The report said senior U.S. military officials have discussed launching limited airstrikes against Iranian targets inside Iran or outside of the country. So they're discussing actually the U.S. launching airstrikes inside Iran. These officials say that intelligence support for Israel is more likely than the airstrikes, but these are conversations that are happening. And this doesn't surprise me. I mean, we've been kind of talking about what kind of support the U.S. could give Israel in this, and we know that they're definitely drawing up different possibilities that go from the extreme of launching direct airstrikes on Iran, or just by providing intelligence for it. There's probably there's different options in between, like trying to hit Iranian targets, IRGC targets elsewhere in the region, or hitting Iranian assets, in the sea or something like that. But they are actually discussing U.S. strikes inside Iran. So far, no final decision on U.S. action has been made, according to this report, and the U.S. officials said that Israel has not briefed the U.S. on its specific plans to strike Iran in response to the Iranian missile barrage that hit Israel last week. You all know the context, but I always mention in my coverage of this is that Iran launched these ballistic missiles at Israel in response to all sorts of Israeli escalations, because you see that missing from the mainstream reports on this. The context is just never there. So the NBC report said U.S. officials were worried that Israel could launch its attack while Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is meeting with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon on Wednesday. But after the report was published, Gallant's trip to the U.S. has been canceled. So he's not going to be there on Wednesday. Israeli media said that the trip was postponed because Netanyahu wants to speak with President Biden and wants the Israeli Security Cabinet to agree on a plan to attack Iran before Gallant heads to Washington. So he wants it to be all planned out before Gallant goes and meets with Austin and other U.S. officials. So the Israelis are considering several types of targets to hit in Iran: military and intelligence infrastructure, air defenses, and energy facilities. Based on media reports, Israel does not plan to strike the nuclear facilities in its first attack, but it could if Iran hits back and the situation turns into a full-blown war, which Israeli officials think is likely going to happen. And of course, they want the U.S. to be involved in this. So, I am saying, based on what I've read, that I don't think they're going to go for the nuclear facilities right away. But, it's possible that they just go for a huge attack just right away. If they expect Iranian retaliation, they're just going to go big. And then this way they can get the U.S. directly involved right before the presidential election, when they know the Biden administration is not going to do anything to radically alter U.S. support for Israel. When they know that the U.S. is going to go along basically with whatever they do. We've seen all sort of new reports now. Bob Woodward has a new book coming out about how mad Biden is at Netanyahu, how he cursed at him and called him an effing liar or whatever. But I think this is just part of this narrative that Biden somehow is just being taken along on this ride, when in reality, and we see him say this, he is an ardent Zionist himself. He says he's always supported Israel, and he's always going to support Israel. So he is complicit in everything that Netanyahu has done, because he gives Israel most of its weapons and has given Israel more military aid in this past year than any other year before. So, Biden's all in on this, despite that whole narrative. He might get frustrated with Netanyahu. I'm sure he does, to some degree. But this idea that he's just like so mad about it, and is always cursing at him and saying things, I think it's just a narrative. All right, so the next one here, Vice President Harris says that Iran is the U.S.'s greatest adversary. So things really aren't looking good here. We got these reports of the U.S. considering direct strikes on Iran. Now we have the vice president and the presidential nominee calling Iran the U.S.'s greatest adversary. So Vice President Kamala Harris has named Iran as the U.S.'s top adversary, pointing to the recent Iranian missile attack on Israel, which came in response to multiple Israeli escalations. When asked in her 60 Minutes interview which country she believed was the U.S.'s greatest adversary, Harris said, quote, "I think there's an obvious one in mind, which is Iran. Iran has American blood on their hands, and what we saw in terms of just this attack on Israel, 200 ballistic missiles, what we need to do to ensure that Iran never achieves the ability to be a nuclear power, that is one of my highest priorities," end quote. Harris was then asked if she had proof that Iran had nuclear weapons and if she would take military action. And she responded, quote, "I'm not going to talk about hypotheticals at this moment," end quote. So while there's always a lot of hype around Iran's nuclear weapons program, the CIA just said this week that there's no evidence Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon. We'll get more into that in the next story. But we see both Harris and Trump are running on platforms of being extremely pro-Israel and very hawkish on Iran. Trump said last week that Israel should strike the Iranian nuclear facilities, that the U.S. should support that, criticizing Biden for warning against that idea. So what's funny about this is Harris's, what she's saying here, and if you watch this interview, I mean, she didn't do good at all. She, at least in this segment, but she just seemed like she was caught off guard by like every question. So anyway, what I'm saying here is that her saying that Iran is the biggest adversary, that actually goes against the official line of the Biden administration, which is that China is the biggest adversary, the biggest threat facing the U.S., the biggest foreign threat. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy labeled China as the most comprehensive and serious challenge to U.S. national security strategy. Russia came in second, and Iran was lumped into a category of persistent threats that also included North Korea and organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So, what's funny here, like, I don't subscribe to this idea that these countries are adversaries and that they pose a big threat to the United States. They pose a threat to the U.S. empire in many ways. But, you think about it, Iran, there's no reason for Iran to be the U.S.'s enemy or an adversary. The only reason why that's the case is because the U.S. supports Israel. The U.S. is allied with Israel. Without that, there would really be no reason for any of this talk at all. And that's very clear when she pivots to, oh, it's Iran. Look at that. Look, they just attacked Israel. So she still took a pretty hawkish tone with China, saying that the U.S. must win the competition for the 21st century with China. And that is something that President Biden has said that's kind of a line. She kind of just regurgitated this talking point that we've heard from Biden and other officials in the administration before, which, if you think about it, is kind of a really insane thing to say. Biden, I remember when he said this, when he first came into office, his rhetoric around China was extremely hawkish. It kind of toned down, but the policies didn't change. But he said, we're in a competition with China to win the century. So what does that mean? I mean, the implication there is, world war. At least that's where my mind goes. And then when she was asked if she would defend Taiwan if China was attacked, and again said that she would not get into hypotheticals. And Biden has actually repeatedly said that he would intervene if China attacks Taiwan. He said it, I believe, 4 times. The first 3 times he said it, the White House walked it back. And then the 4th time, the White House did not walk it back. So that breaks decades of what they call strategic ambiguity about the issue. All right, so the next one here, the CIA says that there's no evidence Iran has decided to build a nuclear weapon. CIA Director William Burns said Monday that there's no evidence Iran has decided to build nuclear weapons, comments that come amid all these calls in the U.S. and Israel to strike Iranian nuclear sites. Burns said at the Cipher Brief Security Conference, quote, "No, we do not see evidence today that the Supreme Leader has reversed the decision that he took at the end of 2003 to suspend the weaponization program. In 2003, Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei issued a fatwa prohibiting the development of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. And his predecessor, Khomeini, the first supreme leader after the Islamic Revolution, he also rejected the idea of starting a WMD program. I linked to a story there from Gareth Porter. It's called When the Ayatollah Said No to Nukes. And he spoke with the IRGC official, former IRGC commander, who said during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, which was a really horrific war that lasted for a long time, Iran was facing, an Iraqi army was facing a Saddam Hussein who was using chemical weapons. And some people in the IRGC said, hey, let's start a WMD program, basically. And he said no. And that was a U.S.-backed Iraq, by the way, a U.S.-backed Saddam Hussein. The U.S. was very aware that he was using chemical weapons, gave him intelligence for some of those attacks. And then just about a year after the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam became the next enemy. So Burns said that if Iran did move to make a nuclear weapon, U.S. intelligence would likely be aware of the decision. He said, quote, "I think we are reasonably confident that working with our friends and allies, we will be able to see it relatively early on," end quote. So he said some things about the uranium enrichment. They're enriching uranium at 60%, which is high, but it's still below the 90% needed for weapons grade. He repeated this claim that Iran might be able to produce 1 bomb's worth of weapons grade material in just 1 week. But the NBC report, which I got this from, actually noted that most experts say it would take at least 1 year to actually build a nuclear warhead, and then they would need to test it and all that. And an important point here, Iran, their enrichment levels were extremely restricted by the Iran nuclear deal. Trump pulled out of that, imposed the sanctions. And then every time Iran increased the uranium enrichment, it was directly in response to an Israeli attack. In 2020, Israel assassinated a scientist inside Iran, a nuclear scientist. After that, they started enriching uranium at 20%. In 2021, Israel somehow blew up an explosive inside an Iranian nuclear facility. They timed it to coincide with the U.S. and Iran resuming negotiations on the nuclear deal to sabotage the talks. And in response to that, Iran increased enrichment to 60%. So if Israel does go for the nuclear facilities and they don't destroy, don't really do much damage to them, I'm sure we'll see Iran take some other step to increase their nuclear enrichment or something like that. All this stuff is directly in response to Israeli attacks. All right, so the next one here, and another thing is that there is talk in Iran that maybe the Ayatollah should reconsider and that they should get nukes. Of course, there's hawks in Iran that want that. But the thing is, what Burns said, I think, is right. That if Iran does make that decision, Mossad, CIA might be aware of that, and then they probably know that would mean a direct strike from probably the U.S. with those really heavy bunker busters that they have. So that's definitely they keep that in mind in Iran. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. says that it opposes a ceasefire in Lebanon. So the State Department said Tuesday that it does not want to see a ceasefire in Lebanon and supports the heavy Israeli bombardment of the country to degrade Hezbollah. State Department spokesman Matt Miller was asked about comments from Hezbollah Deputy Sheikh Naim Qassem, who said the group supports efforts by Lebanon's parliament speaker to reach a ceasefire without mentioning that it must also include a ceasefire in Gaza. So when asked about Hezbollah suggesting they would be open to a ceasefire, this is what Miller said. He said, quote, "Now that Hezbollah is on the back foot and is getting battered, suddenly they've changed their tune and want a ceasefire," end quote. Miller claimed that the U.S. ultimately wants a diplomatic solution, but voiced strong support for Israeli military operations, which have killed more than 1,250 people, including over 100 children, since mid-September. He said, quote, "We support Israel's efforts to degrade Hezbollah's capability," end quote. So the U.S. is also calling for Lebanon to hold new presidential elections amid this huge bombardment. They're saying now's the time to hold an election. Lebanon has not had a president since 2022. Because of the many different factions in parliament, they have not agreed to elect one. Hezbollah is one of those factions, but they are not the sole reason why there's no president, which is how Miller was kind of framing it. And Hezbollah's political wing currently holds 15 seats in the nation's 128-seat parliament. Miller said, quote, "What we want to see come out of this situation ultimately is Lebanon able to break the grip Hezbollah had on the country, break the stranglehold Hezbollah had over the country," end quote. So this is very strong support for what Israel's doing in Lebanon. And the U.S. is still characterizing the Israeli assault as a limited incursion, despite the massive bombings that we're seeing in Beirut and across the country. And now, before Israel launched this escalation, before they killed Nasrallah, the U.S. was calling for a temporary 21-day ceasefire. That was what Matt Miller said that they wanted. But the U.S. didn't put any real pressure on Israel to accept the truce, since they approved that massive $8.7 billion in new military aid for Israel the same day that Netanyahu rejected the ceasefire. So they were never serious about that. And we also know from that Politico report that the White House officials were egging Israel on to escalate in Lebanon. So this is what they wanted all along, I believe. And we had Lebanon's foreign minister say that Nasrallah actually agreed to the 21-day ceasefire before being killed. Since that came out, the State Department denied that they were informed that Hezbollah accepted the ceasefire. They said it was possible that they did, but they were not informed of that. CNN had a report citing a Western source familiar with the negotiations who said that Hezbollah did agree to the ceasefire. So I think that is a possible reason why Israel decided to kill him that day. All right, so the next one here. Netanyahu threatens to turn Lebanon into Gaza. So this is what the U.S. is supporting. This is the same day Matt Miller's up there. I mean, this press conference said it was crazy the way he was just full-throated defending the Israeli invasion. Also, Liam Cosgrove, if you're familiar with him, he's a reporter for the Gray Zone. He called Matt Miller out, basically said, "You're supporting genocide, you're risking nuclear war in Ukraine. People are sick of this BS." There's a great clip going around of that. I mean, Matt Miller, it's hard to watch these press conferences, so that was nice to see. So Israeli airstrikes continued to pound Lebanon on Tuesday, killing at least 36 people and wounding 150, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu threatened to destroy the country like he has Gaza. In a video posted on social media, Netanyahu said he was addressing the people of Lebanon and told them to save the country of Lebanon or face the destruction and suffering that's been inflicted on Gaza. He said, quote, "You have an opportunity to save Lebanon before it falls into the abyss of a long war that will lead to destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza. I say to you, the people of Lebanon, free your country from Hezbollah so this war can end," end quote. So basically saying some of the same things as Matt Miller, except an explicit threat to turn Lebanon into Gaza. And a lot of these scenes from these airstrikes look very similar to Gaza. And Israeli strikes were reported across Lebanon again on Tuesday. And there was also Israel sent more troops into Lebanon. They sent a 4th Division of ground troops. And according to Middle East Eye, based on the recent Israeli mobilizations, there may be 15,000 Israeli troops inside Lebanon. This is what the U.S. is still calling a limited incursion. All right, so the next one here, Israel drops depleted uranium bombs inside Beirut. This article is from The Cradle. On October 6th, the head of the president of the Lebanese Association of Social Medicine said Israel has been bombing the southern suburbs of Beirut using banned bombs with uranium warheads, and called for collecting samples from the bomb sites to send to the UN as part of an internal investigation. So usually these are used with tank shells or artillery shells, because depleted uranium is kind of the waste of enriched uranium, and it can make a very heavy armor. It's used to make armor for tanks, and it's also used for shells that are designed to penetrate heavy armor. And whenever we talk about depleted uranium, I say that it's radioactive, and then you get all these comments, people saying, no, it's actually not radioactive. But it is, it's a low level of radiation. And these depleted uranium has really polluted places like Iraq, and cancer rates have skyrocketed where the U.S. used it there, both during the Gulf War and the invasion. And there's all this research funded by the Pentagon, funded by the U.S., that says, oh, depleted uranium is not that bad for people. But that's because the U.S. has dumped so much of it in Iraq and also in Kosovo. And there's all sorts of evidence that it does cause birth defects. I mean, you still see birth defects in Fallujah today, horrific birth defects, and cancer. So there's some evidence here, apparently, of the U.S. using it, and it says that it could be in the GBU-31 that are guided munitions, and they have an ability to penetrate heavily reinforced concrete or steel structures. All right, so the next one here, Israeli forces kill 56 Palestinians in Gaza. So Gaza's health ministry said Tuesday that Israeli forces killed at least 56 Palestinians and wounded another 278 in the previous 24-hour period as Israel continues to launch strikes across the Strip. The ministry said the latest violence brings its recorded death toll since October 2023 to 41,965 and the number of wounded to 97,590. So we know that these figures are in undercount. They only include bodies that have been brought to the hospitals and morgues. We have those American healthcare workers. They estimate over 118,000 people have been killed in Gaza. That includes starvation and other indirect causes of the Israeli siege. So Israeli strikes on Tuesday included attacks on the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. On Sunday, Israel issued the new evacuation order for the north. They want all the civilians to clear out of there. It's part of this ethnic cleansing plan known as the General's Plan. The first step is to try to move everybody out of there, and whoever stays, kill them or starve them to death. And it looks like they are carrying this out. And the Palestinian news agency Wafa reported that the streets of Jabalia are strewn with the bodies of dead Palestinians. There's also fierce clashes going on in the area, according to the Qassem's Brigade, which is the armed wing of Hamas. An Al Jazeera journalist reporting from Jabalia said the Israeli military was ordering civilians to leave the camp, but was also blocking the way out. Seen reports also of people getting shot, trying to, going where Israel told them to go. There's also heavy Israeli airstrikes in central and southern Gaza. So this next story here, so I didn't realize this. I saw Caitlin Johnstone had an article kind of summarizing all these horrific escalations we've been seeing. Israel ordered 3 hospitals in northern Gaza to be evacuated. This article is from Turkey's Anadolu Agency. So the Israeli army ordered the evacuation of patients and staff at 3 hospitals in the northern Gaza Strip. The enclave's health ministry said Tuesday. Israel demands the evacuation of Kamal Adwan Hospital, the Indonesian hospital, and Al-Auda Hospital from patients and health personnel. So they're ordering the evacuation of all the patients and all the personnel in these hospitals. Again, this ethnic cleansing plan or extermination plan seems to be on. I saw some stuff in Jerusalem Post suggesting that they were considering doing it slower than initially planned so they don't get too much, so the U.S. or there's not too much international scrutiny of what they're doing. But again, I mean, this is something, if this happened a year ago, 6 months ago, all the attention would be on this. But now with everything else happening, Lebanon, stuff with Iran, it's perfect cover for Netanyahu, for Israel to carry out this extermination, ethnic cleansing that they want to do in northern Gaza, and then do it in the rest of Gaza after that. All right, so the next one here, disabled Palestinian woman burnt alive by an Israeli soldier. This article is from Middle East Eye. This is a horrific story. It's an account from a father, a Palestinian man who had a disabled daughter who was 34 years old, who had, I believe, cerebral palsy. And basically what he said, they were in a tent camp, and for whatever reason, there was some fighting around, and he got separated from her. And then according to his account, the Israeli troops set the tents on fire while his 34-year-old disabled daughter, who he said he took care of her whole life, basically, it was like having an infant for 34 years. And he said the Israeli troops set the tent on fire and burned her alive. It's just, I mean, the horror that we hear from Gaza, I bet there's so many stories similar to this. The, kind of murders, killings that we don't hear about, just in individual stories like this. Just think about how many there are of people losing their family members like this. All right, so the next one here, 7 civilians killed in an Israeli airstrike on Damascus. This one is from Jason Ditz. The Syrian Defense Ministry has reported that Israel carried out an attack on an apartment building in the residential neighborhood of Maza in the capital city of Damascus. At least 7 civilians, including women and a child, were killed in the attack. They warn the death toll is preliminary, and they are still looking for survivors in the rubble. There is the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in the UK. They're like very pro-opposition. But they've been pretty critical of Israel's airstrikes recently. They said that the building was believed to be in use by Hezbollah and the IRGC. 2 of the dead in the attack were described as foreigners, though yet to be identified. In addition to the people killed in the attack, at least 11 others were reported wounded in the attack. The bottom 3 floors of the building have been described as totally destroyed, and more than 20 cars parked in the area near the buildings have been damaged. And Israel has been targeting this neighborhood quite a bit lately. Over the past week, it seems like they've been bombing Syria almost every day, and lots of civilians have been killed in those strikes. So another Israeli massacre, this time in Syria. All right, so the next one here. Israeli soldiers beat Palestinian activists to death. This article is from Middle East Eye. Israeli forces on Monday beat to death a renowned 66-year-old Palestinian activist after raiding his home in the occupied West Bank. Ziad Abu Halal was a popular tribal figure in the West Bank, famous for peacefully confronting Israeli soldiers during demonstrations and standing between them and protesters. And I've seen these videos of him confronting Israeli soldiers, always never armed, never being violent. So his son told AFP that around 3 a.m. on Monday, a group of Israeli forces stormed their home in Dura, south of Hebron. Again, this is in the West Bank, trying to arrest one of their relatives. His son said, quote, "My father tried to stop them, so they struck him twice on the chest, then pushed him, causing his chest to collide with the door, which led to his martyrdom," end quote. The soldiers then withdrew from the house, leaving him unconscious. He was taken to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Oh, here's one of the videos of him. You kind of just see standing in front of these Israeli troops as they're firing probably at protesters behind him. Man, so they beat him to death. I mean, the violence in the West Bank, it's another one of those things. If this was happening before October 7th, this would be, so much attention would be on what's happening in the West Bank, but so much of it goes under the radar. All right, so let's see. I think we have one more story here. The U.S. to loan Poland $3 billion to purchase helicopters. This article is from Kyle Anzalone. So Washington has agreed to give Warsaw a $3 billion loan to buy American-made Apache helicopters. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. has lavished Poland with military assistance, loans to buy weapons, and billions in arms sales. The U.S. is set to use the foreign military financing program to give Poland a $3.08 billion loan to buy the Apaches. Warsaw has received several FMF loans over the past year, totaling $7 billion. So when I first saw this story, I thought it was like an old story. I said, didn't they just get a loan? They've gotten a total of $7 billion in loans from the U.S. over the past year for weapons. And this is one way that kind of the arms makers are really cashing in on the war in Ukraine. Poland, a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, Europe in general, have really increased their military budgets. They're buying a lot of these weapons that Ukraine is using, like the HIMARS rockets. They want some javelins, some stingers. So, it's just big, it's a boom in business, not just the weapons being dumped into Ukraine and the ones being the contracts to replace those weapons, but also kind of just this overall increase in military spending and increase in U.S. military aid to Europe that we've seen as well. So that is it for the news for today. I know all this basically, except for that last story, is Middle East stuff. I feel like I'm kind of dropping the ball in Ukraine and everything. But, latest I've seen on there is Russia's continuing to advance in the Donbass. No big escalations from the U.S. or NATO. But, it really does look like Israel is just really ramping things up. And they're using this, they time this to do it right before the election. And what could happen? Who knows what could happen in the next few weeks, in the next day? Man. So go check out our viewpoints. One from Mohammed Sahimi, Iranian Ahmed Chalabis are helping Israel plan bombing Iran. One from Daniel Larison, reject the failed hawkish consensus on Iran. One from Nick Terse, Israel's year of killing, maiming, starving, and terrorizing the people of Gaza. One from Zachary Yost, America's failed grand strategy guarantees the draft's return. And our spotlights from Eli Clifton, Israel's wars mean massive returns for U.S. arms company investors. So please go check all of that out. That was a lot of stuff that we went over today. Again, please help us with our fundraiser if you can. Other ways you can support us is telling your friends about antiwar.com, share this show, like, subscribe, comment. Follow us on social media. The Instagram is looking really awesome lately. Addie, who does the post there, has been doing a really great job. It seems like she keeps getting better and better. So definitely follow us on Instagram if you don't. And then follow us on X or Twitter. Follow me on there. My account is @DeCampDave. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.